Okay, record. Last week, Nita taught on Exodus 19, surprise, surprise, on Israel's and Moses' arrival at Mount Sinai. And Yahweh kind of says, hey, I've done it. I've brought you to myself. You are my treasured possession. And that's what he promised. He promised in Exodus 6. If you remember Exodus 6, he says, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty axe judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. So Exodus 19, he says, yeah, I did it. I brought you to myself, and you're going to be my treasured possession. What does it look like for me to be your God and you to be my people? And so this section is the beginning of what people call the Book of the Covenant within Exodus. We are switching from, God's deliverance to God's law. And so the first thing that Yahweh tells Moses in this law are the 10 Commandments, or 10 words, or in Greek it's called the Decalogue. So if you want to sound smart, you can call it the Decalogue. But I always get a little, this is kind of the boring part of, of Exodus in my mind. And I also get a little itchy when God tells me to do things. So I'd like to remind you that the vast majority of the Bible is narrative. It's just story. And a small minority are commands. And there's a reason for that. God wants us to teach us through story so that we understand the commands in context. We know who's giving it. And so he reveals himself through the commands. He also reveals himself through the ways he gives the commands. And I think I'm going to be focusing more on how God presented the law than the law itself. Because you wanted to know about all the 10 Commandments, you can probably listen to any other teaching on the 10 Commandments. But let's read it. Here's the passage in Exodus 20. God spoke all these words. I, Yahweh, am your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. That's exactly what he said in Exodus 6. Where he's saying, I fulfilled that promise. So that's kind of the first word, I guess, is that. Verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image of any like or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water below. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, responding to the transgression of fathers by dealing with the children to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me, and showing covenant faithfulness to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. That's we're going to get into that in Exodus 34, I think. It's foreshadowing. You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not hold guiltless anyone who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So remember Scott taught about that. So he's making it a commandment. For 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your cattle or the resident foreigner who is in your gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth and on the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. Honor your father and mother, that you may live a long time in the land that Yahweh your God is giving to you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything else that belongs to your neighbor. There you go. Pretty straightforward. People like to put these 10 commandments on posters. They also like to put it in monuments in front of courthouses with, American flags and stuff. Go America. It's actually, this has been the center of a lot of controversy around there, but yeah, love putting these Ten Commandments everywhere, and for good reason too. It is synonymous with the covenant. The parallel passage, the same story retold in Deuteronomy. He says, you heard the covenant, hyphen the Ten Commandments. And so these Ten Commandments are kind of like encapsulates the entire covenant that Moses is about to lay out. And so, yeah, if you wanted to put the Old Testament law, on a sticky note, this is what you do, these Ten Commandments. But I want to talk about these tablets. There's always two of them, and they always think that, oh yeah, one has half of them, and the other has the other half. But that's not actually true. There's two copies. And why were there two copies? Full copy of the law on one tablet, full copy of the law on the second tablet. Now I'm getting into something pretty nerdy. We'll talk about some ancient Near East peace treaties. I think we already talked about this. No, we didn't. I don't know. I'm confused about stuff I've read and stuff I heard here. There's this thing in ancient Near East called the suzerain vassal covenant. When a conquering king takes over a land, they make an agreement. Like, I'm going to defend your walls and you're going to give me taxes. And so they write out this covenant and they make two copies. One for the vassal and one for the suzerain. So the conquering king would keep a copy and the conquered would keep a copy. And if anyone broke that contract, the contract was null and void, and they could, say, hey, you didn't do this. And the interesting thing about these two tablets, both of them ended up in the Ark of the Covenant. God was telling them, basically, like, even if you break your side of the deal, I'm going to keep my covenant. It's an object lesson. And if you think back when we were teaching through Hebrews, the author of Hebrews makes a similar reference to Genesis 15, where Abraham is told to bring all those animals and cut them in half and split them apart. And there was a tradition back then that the two parties would walk through the animals, split off apart animals, and say, if either of us breaks this covenant, let what done to these animals be done to me. But then Yahweh puts Abraham to sleep so he can't move, and Yahweh himself walks through the covenant animals, covenant carcasses. So this is interesting. Yahweh decides to use the common, practice of the time to communicate his covenant love, covenant faithfulness to the people. The thing with Abraham probably happened around 2000 BC, and I think that was the practice around then. And this was around 1400 BC, and this was the practice around that time. Even more nerdy, if you want to know, the book of Deuteronomy and this section of Exodus very closely match the Hittite treaty. The Hittites are an interesting bunch. There was no evidence that they even existed or that there was a Hittite empire. And so for centuries, skeptics thought the Hittites were made up, the Bible made up for the fact that they were around in this region of the world, because they originated in Turkey. But then about 150 years ago, they found archaeological evidence, and they found this treaty that the Hittites made with Egypt, proving that the Hittites were hanging out right around there in the ancient Near East. And it also proves the Hittites were around there in 1400 BC, in the 2nd century BC. And up until 150 years ago, skeptics of the Bible thought, oh yeah, Exodus must have been made up after the fact, 700 BC. And they were just using what the Assyrians did. Lo and behold, in the 1850s, 1870s, they discovered all this stuff. And Exodus actually more closely maps the culture and the practices of the time, 1400 BC. So, checkmate atheists. But yeah, there's some nerdy stuff. We'll get back to the actual content of this. I thought it was cool. Okay, so the law. The Ten Commandments are like the first taste of the 600 and whatever 36 laws that get rolled out in the next 3 books of the Bible. They're seen like, as a distinct set, but also symbolic of the whole thing, as I already said. New Testament scholars like to put the law into 2 categories, moral law and case law. And so the 10 Commandments would fall almost entirely under moral law. And then all the punishments and regulations are applying these 10 Commandments to everyday life. Say, hey, you coveted your neighbor's wife, here's the punishment. Or, you were idolatrous, here's the punishment. But I would like to talk about how God communicates his law. And by doing that, I'd like to talk about the first law. The first law in the Bible is Genesis 2:17. In the garden, God tells Adam and Eve, you can eat of any tree in the garden, but not this tree, not the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There was only one law. Now there's 10, but back then there was one. And when they broke that law, it severed their relationship with God. Not completely, but it broke what they had. And it's similar. God knew what was best for Adam and Eve, and he knew what was best for Israel. And he gave regulations in their best interest. God wanted an intimate relationship with Adam and Eve. Also now he wants an intimate relationship with Israel. And also, Anita pointed out that the relationship came before the law. And it was within the relationship that the law was given. Clearly, if Adam and Eve want to stay in the garden and stay in their role as image bearers of God, they needed to follow the regulation. And when they broke the regulation, they were booted from the garden. And if you think about this law, you can eat of any tree except this tree. It ensured that they were free to do whatever they wanted as long as they didn't do that one thing. It's the same thing with the 10 Commandments. As long as you don't murder, you can, as long as you don't covet, as long as you're free to live your life, which is much more freeing than a positive requirement. You must do this. So the thou shalt nots are actually ensuring our freedom more than the thou shalls. In the New Testament, in Galatians, Paul calls the law, and specifically the New Covenant, the law of liberty. I'd like to argue that it always has been a law of liberty. I thought of an illustration. Think about this. Imagine you're an alien. It's always fun to imagine you're an alien. And you come upon this contraption in the desert. You have no idea what it's for. You're not sure, and you figure out, you open the door, and you look in the glove compartment, and there's this manual that has the same logo that's on the car. And you're like, wow, this must be related to the car. And you open it up and you find out, Ford made this car, and it's for driving around. But you see, there's all these rules and things about how to take care of the car, what oil to put in, to not overinflate the tires. And so, you might come to the conclusion wow, Ford really doesn't want me to drive this car. Ford really doesn't want me to use this car. There's too many rules. That's not true. Ford gave this owner's manual so that you could use the car and not break it, and you could enjoy it for a long time. It's clear that Ford intends this car to be used for its purposes, to drive around for transportation. In the same way, I think the most remarkable statement in the Bible about us is in the first two chapters, about that we were created in God's image. And everything else is application, of that truth. When we learn about God, or we learn about Ford Motors, or we learn about cars, like we learn about ourselves. When we learn about God, we learn some about ourselves because we're made to be like him. And so when God is revealing himself in Exodus, he's also revealing us to us in a way. Not saying that we are God, but in the garden, we were perfect image bearers. And by relating to that, we can regain our role as image bearers of God. You think about when you go to the pool, you don't say, oh, I'm not allowed to run, or I'm not allowed to dive in the shallow end. It's not worth going. You're going to the pool to have fun. And these rules actually ensure that you will have fun. It increases the chances of you having fun and not breaking your skull. And in the same way, God has given us, regulations for our benefit. If we don't murder someone, it's going to go well with us. When we honor our mother and father, it will go well with us. I don't think it's to hang up the rules on the wall and try to follow. I think it's to look at the God who created us and try to live in line with what he intended our lives to look like. Yeah, let's take a look at what Jesus said about the law, because he said some interesting stuff, specifically about these commandments. In Matthew 22, he says, one of them, the expert in religious law, asked a question teaching us which commandment in the law is the greatest. Jesus said to him, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. These aren't even part of the 10 Commandments. Why would Jesus be quoting Deuteronomy 6, which is a chapter after the 10 Commandments are given in Deuteronomy, and Leviticus 19? Well, as I said before, a positive requirement is much more restricting and a higher call than a negative prohibition. And so if you notice these, to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, is much a higher call than not to make an idol. And to love your neighbor as yourself is a much higher call than not to murder. And Jesus did not. He affirmed and intensified the 10 Commandments. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, that entire thing is about the 10 Commandments. If you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. If you hate your brother, you committed murder in your heart. Jesus did not come to do away with the law. He came to fulfill the law in himself and to hold people to a higher standard. And if you look at these 10 Commandments, they fall into these two commandments that Jesus gave. The first 4 that, not having other gods, not worshiping idols, not taking the Lord's name in vain, and keeping the Sabbath would fall kind of into this first commandment to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But I think if you just did these 4, you wouldn't necessarily be doing that. And the second, honor your father and mother, not murdering, not committing adultery, not stealing, not giving false testimony, not coveting, that would fall under this loving your neighbor thing. So I don't think this is, canonical or something. This is what God intended, but I think Jesus was showing that these 2 commands can capture the entire law. Yeah, and so God, intends us to live a full life. He does not intend us to be full of restrictions. And these 10 commandments are, part of that. If you look in the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation, law and blessing are always linked, or always go hand in hand. You can think of things as indicatives and imperatives. Indicatives are something that is indicated about us, about God, about people, about the world. And the Bible is chock full of them, as I said. And they always come with the imperatives. We aren't supposed to just do things because we're just because. As it says in Ephesians, we forgive because God forgave us. Or, God has redeemed Israel, and He's now their God, and they are His people. And if they're going to be His people, they do these 10 commands. And so to extract the law and read it on its own is to take it out of context and to live under law without relationship. I'm not going to read this. This is the parallel passage in Deuteronomy 5. I think it sheds more light on the whole, did they go up the mountain? Did they not? The chronology in Deuteronomy is Moses reflecting back on the events of Exodus and summarizing them. So, if you wanted to think about that, you can read it. It also talks about at the end, so be careful to do what Yahweh, your God, has commanded. Do not turn aside to the right or to the left. Walk in obedience to all that Yahweh, your God, has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess. So it seems clear that if you follow the law, you will live a fuller life, a longer life. You'll live in the blessing of God. So with that, I wanted to break back up into the same groups and discuss the content of the 10 commandments, or what does the idea of the law being this manufacturer's recommendations, how does that change your perspective? And here's a little controversy, what would change if you oriented towards these Jesus' 2 commandments versus the 10 commandments? And is there any difference between fulfilling the 10 commandments or fulfilling these 2 commandments? Are you off the hook for doing the 10 commandments now that we're in the new covenant? Food for thought. I'll just pray and then we can break up, and then I'll kind of dismiss you after that. But you can keep discussing after that. Don't feel like you have to leave. God, I feel a little weird because we didn't really talk about the 10 commandments at all. Hopefully we can talk about that in the discussion. I pray that you would shed light on your word. I feel like I made my point that, we need to think differently about the law, or not think about it so legalistically. I pray that we would focus on our relationship with you, and that obedience would come out of that. I pray for your discussion today, that we would, just come away with a clearer understanding of what you've called us to, the life you've called us to live, and pray that going forward through the rest of Exodus, that you would just be shedding light on your word in new ways that we haven't seen before. Amen.